Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 155, The Merchant. John Connell had an article written about him in a Melbourne newspaper in April 1899. The title of the article was An Australian Millionaire. This got me intrigued to know more about this man and how he made his fortune. Acknowledgement to the ancestry public tree that features the Connell family members. There is a wealth of detailed information, in particular on Ben Connell's tree, so I thank him for sharing the photos and documents of his family. John Connell was born on the 8th of March 1825 in Kilmarnock, Ayrshire, Scotland, and he was the third child of 12, born to Alexander Connell and Jean Cunningham. At the age of 16, he was living with his family at Grange Gate, and it seems the family were members of St Andrew's Free Church in Kilmarnock. The Free Church had an evangelistic focus, and he later supported the English Presbyterian Church. From around 1843 to 1845, he was employed by William McEwen, Sons and Company, Glasgow, Scotland. They were a well-established firm of sugar refiners. In 1845, he worked for a large tea distributing house in Dublin, Ireland. In 1848, aged 23, he emigrated to Victoria. Prospects at the time were promising. He intended to squat and acquire a farm, but as it was the beginnings of the gold rush, his new commercial experience, skills and inclination pointed him towards trade. Ernest Oldham Connell had information of his grandfather dictated to his daughter Elizabeth Holroyd in around 1982 when he was 78. It has been edited by John Connell in 2008 and further annotations from Elizabeth in March 2014. So I'll be dotting some of that information through what has been found elsewhere. So John had heard that the gold rush had started and he knew that Melbourne was the biggest centre. In 1851 and 1852, he got a clerical job in Melbourne for a short time. But he soon found that if he hired a pony and trap and filled that trap with as much tea as he could carry and take it up to the gold diggings, it was worth literally its weight in gold. Prospectors knew to boil their water. They would pay almost anything to have tea. Ernest Connell, speaking about his grandfather, said that he thought that he did about half a dozen trips up to the goldfields with his trap full of tea. And then he told a story about how he encountered the Kelly gang. So it said that they pinched his bags of gold dust, but they never noticed the gold wedges that he concealed in the cart that were strapped to the underside of the seat. He lost about 1/3 of the value of his load on that trip when the Kelly gang intercepted him. From that time on, he heard the Kelly gang were operating to the west route from Melbourne, then he would go east and approach by way of Bendigo instead, and friendly people on farms would let him know so he could avoid them from that time onwards. So with his earnings, he ended up having enough to buy a share in a grocery store with a Scotsman called Charles Watson. The store was in Swanston Street in Melbourne, and they established it in 1853. It was a wholesale wine and spirit merchant store and a grocer. It was named John Connell and Company. In the Mount Alexander Mail on the 20th of April 1899, there was a story on John Connell. It's titled An Australian Millionaire. Looking at the new store of Sargood & Co., which is rapidly approaching completion in Flinders Street, I was reminded that in the early days its site was squatted upon by Mr. John Connell, the founder of the well-known firm Connell & Hogarth Wholesale Grocers. To visitors from this colony, he is fond of relating his experiences of the beginning of Melbourne, when it was a mere township spread over an area which has been laid out with wonderful prescience as to qualify to become a great city. His first place of business he described to a friend of mine as having been constructed of the most fragile materials obtained from packing cases and kerosene tins. Business was good, profits immense, and the money rolled in hand over fist. Mr. Connell was young and timid as regards to entrusting his cash to the bank,
for one bank had failed, so he concealed it in the store. He fortified it internally with all the iron plates he could get a hold of. One day, a stranger who seemed to have no visible occupation squatted down close beside him, and not long afterwards Mr. Connell's business called him to Bendigo. He was glad to find the store undisturbed on his return, but happened to stand in one corner of it, and he felt the earthenware floor give way beneath his feet. He then discovered that it had been undermined from the adjoining tent, and that his opportune return had no doubt frustrated a daring attempt at burglary. A policeman was called in. Mr. Connell's neighbour mysteriously disappeared, and the owner of the store, acting upon this seasonable advice offered to him by the guardian of the peace, found a more secure place of deposit for his large takings. On the 9th of October 1855, in the dwelling of her father, Thomas Blackhall at Kildare, Geelong, John married Annie Blackhall. John was a member of the Free Church and Annie was of the Independent congregation. Annie had been born in 1836 in Islington, London, the third child of 9, 6 children that survived into adulthood. Her family emigrated, leaving London on the 23rd of December 1852, arriving in Port Jackson on the 29th of April 1853. By 1855, the family were living in Geelong, and Thomas Blackhall himself was a storekeeper. By 1864, the business had expanded to occupy the premises at 17 Swanston Street, and Connell was also seeking for retail outlets in country towns. In that same year, he admitted William Hogarth into the partnership, the business becoming Connell and Hogarth of Melbourne. John also had established a business in New Zealand, John Connell and Company, Dunedin. William Hogarth was a friend of Charles Watson's, and Charles Watson had married Annie Blackhall's sister Ellen. Ellen and Charles didn't like Australia very much, and so John Connell bought the Watsons out and Hogarth removed his share of the stake in the business. Charles and Ellen returned to England and built a country home called Pembury End, just to the north of Tonbridge Wells in Kent, and set themselves up as country gentlefolk. He was a little short of money, having bought out his partners, so he floated a small limited liability company called John Connell & Co Limited, of which he was managing director and chief shareholder. This was in 1854, so he would have been 30 years of age, so getting ahead as a young man in a land of opportunity. He mainly still continued selling imported tea from China and Indian tea from Assam and Ceylon, and he also started importing dried fruit and any food that would keep. John, Annie and their 2 firstborn children, Jenny and John, sailed to London and then returned to Victoria in June 1867. In 1868, a new 3-storey bluestone warehouse was built by architect Charles Webb at 37 Flinders Lane that had a 55-foot frontage onto 33 Collins Street. Connell sold his home, Blythewood, in Kew, and all of its contents in 1869 and left for London. He directed the London operations of the business under the company name John Connell and Company at Dunster House, Mincing Lane, London, and it was a general commission and agency business that specialised in Australian and New Zealand produce. The family purchased a mansion called Bushy Down. They were living very comfortably, 7 domestic servants, a coachman and a gardener. They purchased this home in 1870, so a year after they arrived. It was at Tooting Common. In 1914, the home was acquired by the Tooting Bec Asylum. The Metropolitan Asylums Board decided to double the capacity of the Tooting Bec Asylum and acquired Bushy Down to enlarge it into a 2,200-bed asylum. It wasn't opened up until 1925 because of World War I, but eventually the building was demolished. On the 3rd of March 1873, the Melbourne warehouse was gutted by fire, and the warehouse and the offices were burnt out, forcing the firm to occupy a temporary premises at the corner of Elizabeth and Little Collins Street. They had to hold a massive auction to sell salvaged stock. In July 1873, J.H. French and John Lorimer were admitted as members of the firm, and William Hogarth died in January 1876 at the age of 45 years, and his son William Jr. was a member of the firm. Although the head office and seat of direction at that point was in Melbourne, a Sydney branch opened in 1887 and progressed in leaps and bounds to the point that it became in a leading position. There was also an agency in Brisbane. The business had unbroken success and continuous natural growth. It had sound business principles and administration laid down by John Connell, and it was faithfully adhered to by all of his successors. In February 1887, John Lorimer retired and the co-partnership of Connell, Hogarth and Company was dissolved. In May 1889, the partnership of John Connell, John Cramsey, John Arthur and John Fisher was dissolved, and the business continued under the style of John Connell and Company, with Charles Ewing Graham being admitted into the partnership. Only 2 months later, John Alexander Connell and William John McVitie were admitted into full partnership, and the company relocated to the Bluestone buildings on the corner of Market and Flinders Streets, which they'd occupy for the next 20 years. Annie died on the 5th of January 1890 at the age of 53. Family members suspect that she had Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disease that has an overactive thyroid, which has an increased heartbeat, muscle weakness, and can affect the eyes, causing what's called bulging eyes, and can affect other systems of the body, including the skin, circulation and nervous system. A memorial to Annie was laid by her husband at the West Norwood Cemetery and Crematorium. In mid-1892, John Connell and Company became a limited liability company under the style of John Connell and Company Limited, with T.B. Connell and E.F. Connell as directors and exercising sole control over the Melbourne business. In 1900, the firm became John Connell and Co. Proprietary Limited and moved in 1909 to Gresham House, a large 4-storey building in Burke Street West. In 1947, John Connell and Company Proprietary Limited acquired a 75% controlling interest in the grocery chain S.E. Dickens Proprietary Limited, which was formed in 1920, and S.E. Dickens was a former manager of Moran and Cato in Geelong who introduced self-service supermarket shopping in 1926. The final 25% was purchased by a share offer to the public, and the company changed its name to John Connell Dickens and Company Proprietary Limited, with its head office in Burke Street, combining a competitive advantage of efficient wholesaling with limited self-service. On the 4th of May 1954, John Connell Dickens and Company was floated on the stock exchange, and in 1958, John Connell Dickens and Co. was acquired by Coles Supermarkets. So in effect, John Connell was one of the original grocery store owners that has created Coles Supermarkets today. In 1899, in an article, it was reported that he retired with a fortune, now amounting to $3 million. He is still living on a magnificent estate at Tooting in Surrey, where he has upwards of an acre of grounds under glass as conservatories. John Connell died on the 2nd of April 1904 at his home Bushy Down, and his estate came in at £32,801. There was also a memorial for John Connell at West Norwood Cemetery and Crematorium, and there are other plaques of family members in this memorial. One is for Frank Connell and Ethel Mary Reid. John and Annie's children. The firstborn was Jeannie Connell. She was born in 1857 in South Yarra. In April 1881, she married Thomas Lorimer Corbett, a politician in Lambeth, London, when she was 23 and Thomas 28. They had no children. Thomas died in 1910. Jeannie then married Reverend Edward Miller in London in 1915 when she was 57. The second child, Annie, was born in 1860 in Melbourne and died at the family home on the 15th of January 1891 of tuberculosis, and she was only 31. Ellen, known as Nellie, was born in 1861 in Kew, Victoria. She married George Niven in Wadsworth, London, when she was 29 and George 39. He was a bank manager, and they had 2 boys, but unfortunately both boys died as young men. One son, George Geoffrey Connell Niven, was born in 1892 in Streatham, England, and he died on the 6th of October 1922 at Wandsworth, aged only 30. And Alan Scott Niven, who was born on the 9th of April 1895 in Streatham, England, died on the 4th of November 1917 in World War I at Passchendaele, aged only 22. And Nellie died in September 1943 at Wadsworth, London, aged 82. The fourth child, Lizzie Connell, was born in 1863 in Kew, Victoria. She married David Elder Miller, who had been bestowed a quarter of John Connell's estate. And she married David in 1886 when she was 23 and David 30. David was a tanning extract chemical manufacturer. They had a son and a daughter, May Marjorie Miller, who was born in January 1886 at Streatham, London. May married Lawrence Edward Gillett, an actuary, in other words, a statistician, on the 21st of April 1910 at St Mary's Parish Church, Wimbledon, England, when she was 24, and they had 3 children. May and their son William died on the 3rd of October 1940 in Surrey, England, when their house was bombed. May was 54. Their second child, John Morris Connell Miller, was born on the 10th of April 1887 in Streatham, London. He was 21 when he followed into his father's trade, and he married Rosa Jessie Thompson on the 28th of August 1915 at the All Saints Church in Fulham, England, when he was 28 and Rosa 26. They had 2 children. He had business interests in Canada, and he died on the 30th of November 1951 at Sarnia, British Columbia, Canada, aged 64. And Lizzie Connell died on the 12th of February 1915 at Fairstead in Wimbledon, Surrey, England, aged 52. Their 5th child, John Alexander Connell, was born in August 1865 at Kew, Victoria. He was the first of the sons. He was a hearty, open-handed man, very popular with men and with the ladies, says his great-nephew. And he went out to work under his father, who soon found that he was very good at business and left him in charge of the Australian business that was now importing on a very large scale and storing the goods in transit at warehouses in Melbourne and Sydney. John Jr. married Caroline Ann Cook in April 1903 at St George Hanover Square in London when he was 37 and Caroline 28. They had 5 children. John Jr. was the chairman of John Connell and Company when his father died in 1904. John died on the 7th of April 1914 in Wandsworth, London, aged only 48, and Caroline died only 4 years later. Coming across Putney Common in one of the London thick fogs, Caroline lost her way and fell into a pond. Their firstborn 2 daughters, Joyce and Doris, became wards of their uncle, Ernest Henry Connell. Family stories say that the Connell women didn't really like Caroline, and the Connell men and their sons were never allowed to meet her. So their firstborn was Doris Edith Connell. She was born in 1904, and she married Ernest Percy Oldham in Victoria, Australia in 1928. They had 2 sons, and Doris died in Kew, Victoria in 1993. Joyce Connell was born on the 8th of February 1907 in Wandsworth, London. Joyce married Vivian Ernest Fulks in September 1933 in Hampstead, London. Vivian was a geologist and explorer who was knighted in 1953, so Joyce became Lady Fulks. They then had 3 children with 2 surviving infancy, Hilary and Peter. Lady Joyce died in Cambridge on the 27th of April 1990, and her probate came in at £148,332. The 6th child, Herbert Blackall Connell, was born in 1867 in Kew, Victoria. He died in November 1914 at Barnwood House, Barnwood, Gloucestershire, aged only 47, and he did not marry. The family believed that he had schizophrenia, and he died in a private asylum. Charles William Connell was born in about 1870 at Blackheath, Kent, England, and died in around the 1920s. Says that Charles was a gentle creature who'd been stuck in business and hated it, that John Connell wouldn't allow him to farm, and in those days you were entirely dependent upon your parents until you could earn your own living. The confined atmosphere of Victorian London got Charles down so much that he had to be put away in an asylum where he lived until his 50s, never recovering sufficiently to be sent out in the real world. The 8th child was Arthur James Connell, who died at the age of 2 on the 20th of April 1873 at Tooting in England. Their 9th child, Thomas Blackall Connell, was born in 1873 at Bushy Down in Tooting. He was educated at Merchiston School, and at the age of 18 he was sent to Switzerland for a year to learn French and German, presumably by his father for business reasons. On the 24th of October 1891, he worked for the British consulate in Hamburg. From 1892 he worked in the family business. He visited his brother Frank in the Behan nursing home in East Melbourne in the mid-1890s, and it's there he met his future wife, Edith Mary Catherine Behan. Edith and her 3 sisters ran the private hospital. Edith had been born in New Zealand, and it says that their mother, Phoebe Gundry, married a handsome but worthless Irishman who, when she found she was pregnant for the 6th time, left her high and dry. So this may have been a decision that was made by their mother, that rather than have to leave school early or be sent into service, she scraped together an education for her daughters, and then her daughters ran the private hospital. Edith was said to be the prettiest of the nurses, and at the time, Frank was seen to be the richest bachelor in Melbourne, possibly the richest man in the state of Victoria. He was certainly the catch amongst the bachelors, and she had no hesitation in accepting his proposal. And the marriage notice in the paper. On the 1st of November 1899 at St Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne, Thomas Blackhall, fourth son of John Connell, Esquire, merchant of London, Melbourne and Sydney, to Edith, youngest daughter of Mr William Behan, commercial traveller, New South Wales, formerly of Geelong, Meredith and Melbourne, Victoria. They moved to England not long after their marriage and they had 7 children. The fourth child, Hamish Alastair Connell, was in the military and he died in the sea off St Valery-en-Sceaux in France. He was last seen by fellow officer Tom Bowring helping French soldiers into rescue boats, and the exact cause of his death is not known. Tom Bowring said he was the bravest man that he'd ever known. Hamish was a solicitor and he'd married in 1935 and had 1 son. In 1901, the family were living in Sussex and named their home Mornington. They had 3 servants, a children's nurse and a housemaid and cook. Thomas was described in the census as an Australian general merchant. They also had a home in Eastbourne, which was possibly a holiday home, and Tarawera as their primary residence, which was about 1 kilometre from Bushy Down and named after Mount Tarawera in New Zealand. Thomas was the director for the Australian Merchants Association until he resigned in 1903 to live in Australia. The Australian Merchants Association was the same address as the London branch of John Connell and Company Limited. Upon returning to Australia, they lived at Kooyong. They remained in Australia for 6 years. On the 18th of January 1909, there's a letter from W.G. Hindley saying that it's regretting Thomas's inability to accept the Archbishop's invitation to join the council of the diocese, where his knowledge of men and affairs and his judgment, tact and other gifts of diplomacy would have been of great value to the Church. He looks forward to his return and speaks of his reputation as being an able, upright citizen and a good Christian in the best sense of the word. In 1911, in the census, it shows the family at their holiday home Eastbourne, and it also mentions a home at Chislehurst as their main residence, purchased possibly on returning from Melbourne in 1909. In 1912, he became the commercial director of Aerators Limited Sparklets, and then Thomas joined the AIF. He was an intelligence corps officer in the 1st Division of the Indian Cavalry. He joined up in 1914 as a second lieutenant and an interpreter, but he was given nothing to do, so he left the army and was invalided out and started a small munitions factory making shells, but it nearly bankrupted him. Thomas was a member of a syndicate and he'd made a great deal of money in the London Stock Exchange from 1918 with investments. Thomas bought Pembury End, the home that Charles Watson had built, and the family held this until 1931. On the 18th of October 1921, Thomas visited Cape Vincent, New York, US. And in 1922-1923, he sailed to Melbourne and Sydney, most likely on business-related trips. In February 1928, he visited Jamaica and developed a fever and was treated for malaria. A professor of medicine at a Bristol hospital admitted him and made the final diagnosis. He was transferred to Tunbridge Wells under Dr. Rolls. However, he soon died, weighing only 7 stone, on the 13th of April 1928 at Lonsdale Nursing Home, Tunbridge Wells, Kent, England. His official cause of death was peritonitis from a perforation of his liver after surgery for a hyatid cyst. Hyatids are caused by sheepdogs passing larvae to humans in faeces. His probate went to his widow, Edith, and also John Clifford Connell and Arthur Blackhall Connell. And his effects came in at £172,372. And when it was resworn, it came in at £176,643. So really big money in the 1920s. The 10th child, Ethel May Connell, was born on the 25th of October 1874 at their home in Tooting, London. On the 22nd of May 1900, she married Stuart Bathgate Reid at the Enfield Church in Otago, New Zealand, when she was 25 and Stuart 29. They had 2 daughters, with one surviving infancy, Winifred Connell Reid, who was born in October 1903 in Auckland and did not marry. And Winifred died on the 2nd of November 1979 at Burleigh, Hants, England, aged 76, and she left a probate of £88,000. It was said that Winifred was a plain child and her aunts and uncles were kind to her and always giving her company shares, because they were worried that she would never marry. So at the time of the takeover of the company, Winifred was the biggest shareholder of the business. On the 9th of December 1904, the family moved from New Zealand to London, but Stuart died in 1914 when his daughter was only 11, and Ethel died on the 7th of October 1927 in Kensington, London, aged only 52. Family members suggest that it could have been tuberculosis that killed Ethel that came from the cows at Bushy Down. Her father Frank suffered from tuberculosis and Pott's disease. Ethel also suffered from the hypothyroidism that her mother passed away from. There is a bit of mystery that surrounds Ethel's death, but family reminiscences say that her behaviour was very odd over a long period and that her husband and daughter had a lot to put up with before she died. The 11th child, Ernest Henry Connell, was born on the 30th of December 1875 at Bushy Down. He married Mary Lillian Oldham on the 30th of April 1900 in the former Catholic Apostolic Church in Carlton, Victoria. The Bean sisters, who I mentioned earlier, that ran the private nursing home, got their first cousin, Lillian Oldham, to do the cooking and the housekeeping. Lillian's mother was Rebecca Gundry, so Phoebe Gundry's sister. And this is where she met Ernest Connell. Family members said that she had a romantic affection for a Melbourne doctor called Bob Hardy, who had a very pleasant light baritone voice. Lillian picked up music very easily. She played very pleasantly as a soloist. She had a pleasant contralto voice, and her and Bob Hardy used to sing duets, and she used to play the piano solo. Lillian Oldham was very much in demand as a singer and an accompanist, and she was keen on Bob Hardy, and he made it quite clear to her that if they married, his mother would come and live with them. She was a disagreeable old lady, and Lil said, "If we marry, your mother is not coming too." So Ernest Connell had heard that this relationship was a little bit rocky, and Bob Hardy would often be out of town on business. So he visited the nursing home, and he was hoping that there was a chance, as he'd met her previously and was very struck by her vivacity and general go and charm. When he'd gone to visit Lillian, she wasn't there. So he went and visited a family friend on a station about 200 miles from Melbourne. And there was a rumour going around that he may have been going to propose to Lillian. And his friends at the station said that he'd heard that she would accept his proposal. So Ernest wrote a letter proposing. When she received it, she rubbed her eyes and wondered if she was dreaming, and for 48 hours kept thinking, he couldn't have noticed me. So she did accept via a letter, and she was actually bridesmaid at Tom Connell's wedding and soon too was married herself. And that was written by her son, Ernest, in his reminiscences. So Ernest and Lillian had 5 children, and remember that Ernest took on his nieces, Doris and Joyce, as well. He was described as the most clever of the brothers. He wanted to study medicine, but his father insisted he went into the family business. So in 1900, he took over managing John Connell and Company in Melbourne with his elder brother John. Lillian and Ernest lived at Red Court in Orring Road, Armidale, and then in 1905 they lived at Cabrilla in Caulfield. The family left Melbourne in March 1913 and moved to Edinburgh, Scotland. He finally decided he wanted to fulfil his wish to study medicine. He enrolled in university and at the same time served in the Corporal Royal Army Medical Corps as a medical student at Mesopotamia for 2 years. He achieved his medical degree in 1920. In 1922 he was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he was the first physician in Scotland to employ Freud's psychoanalytical approach, and he also worked as a psychoanalyst under Ernest Jones in London. In 1924, when his brother Frank died, he and his brother John were the beneficiaries of £15,500. In August 1929, he left for a trip to Australia via New York. He died on the 3rd of October 1941 in Edinburgh of heart failure, and apparently hypothyroidism weakened his heart, but it wasn't picked up until later in his life. And the 12th child, Frank Connell, was born in 1878 in Bushy Down, Tooting. He was ill in London with Pott's disease and was sent to Australia's warmth in the mid-1890s. Apparently Ernest was quite cranky that his younger brother had been given the opportunity to go and head the Melbourne part of the company. But the directors felt that at the time, due to Ernest's interest in medicine, that he was not going to have the business mind required at that point. Frank got Pott's disease. Pott's disease is when something goes wrong with the backbone and the rib cage and your shoulders stand up about the level of your ears and your whole frame is twisted. He was ill on arrival and he was sent to the Behan sisters' private nursing home, and this is why Tom Connell visited, where he met and married Edith Behan, and this is also where Ernest had met Lil Oldham. By 1901, Frank returned to England. He resided at the Willows, Lower Common, South Putney, Surrey, and died there on the 23rd of September 1924 at the age of only 46. Family members say that apparently his life became unbearable in later years. Some family members say that he actually ended his life by shooting himself. However, no evidence was found to confirm or deny this. He did not marry. And the 13th child, Blanche Connell, was born in January 1879 at Bushy Down. She was living at Eaton Square, London, when she married Arthur Selbourne Jelf on the 9th of February 1908 at St George Hanover Square, London, when she was 29 and Arthur 32. They had 4 children. Arthur was a civil servant who worked for the Federated Malay States Government Service, and as a government service cadet from 1899 to 1902, assistant district officer in 1905, clerk to the state government from 1905 to 1908. He was seconded for military service in the intelligence area from 1917 to 1918. Blanche died on the 9th of November 1917 at the Hamel, Northumberland Avenue, Putney, Surrey, England, aged only 38. Her youngest child had only been born in the May. Arthur remarried in 1923 and had 3 more children, and he became Governor of Jamaica and was knighted in 1932. So the amazing story of John Connell. He's arrived and come up with the idea of getting a cart and a buggy and delivering tea to the goldfields, and that allowed him to amass a fortune.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.